This program is presented and distributed by Keep the Faith on the web at www.keepthefaith.org.
Second talk I'm giving is called The Prefabricators, and it's going to have a great deal to do with the influence of the press upon the council. But before I begin, I'd better make a little correction to my last talk. Father Barrero pointed out to me I called Pope John the 23rd the Venerable, and he's now blessed. He was beatified last September. And I should have remembered that because I was there. Yes. Yes, right. Well, I had my mind on Pius IX the whole of the time. So, I'm going to start off, before talking about the press and the Second Vatican Council, by saying something about the press and the First Vatican Council, which we know a lot about it thanks to Cardinal Henry Manning. And we can draw up a comparison of what can only be described as the unholy parallel between the role played by the press during the First and the Second Vatican Council. This parallel is so close that it can only be concluded that the animating force behind the two press campaigns was the same, and I, of course, would put it down to the enemy of man. Cardinal Manning wrote this: "A belief had spread itself that the Council would explain away the doctrines of Trent," this is the First Vatican Council, "or give them some new or laxer meaning, or throw open some questions supposed to be closed, or come to a compromise or transaction with other religious systems, or at least that it would accommodate the dogmatic stiffness of its traditions to modern thought and modern theology. It is strange that anyone should have forgotten that every General Council from Nicaea to Trent, which has touched on the faith, has made new definitions, and that every new definition is a new dogma, and closes what was opened before, and ties up more strictly the doctrines of faith. This belief, the belief that there was going to be an accommodation of modern thought, this belief, however, excited an expectation mixed with hopes that Rome, by becoming comprehensive, might become approachable, or by becoming inconsistent, might become powerless over the reason and will of men." Comments really hardly necessary on the extent to which these expectations were fulfilled as a result of Vatican II. The principal objective of the Vatican I press campaign was to prevent the definition of papal infallibility. This, of course, was the aim of powerful anti-Catholic forces throughout the world, forces which were largely controlled by the press, even in nominally Catholic countries. And, of course, Masonic influence has always been particularly strong where the press is concerned. And if you know the objectives of Masonry, this is hardly surprising. Once it became known that there were some bishops opposed to the proposed definition, a press campaign was launched in their favour, and the situation here was the opposite of that during Vatican II. During Vatican I, it was those in the minority who were the goodies, and those in the majority who were the baddies. Once the existence of this international opposition at Vatican I, the extent of which was greatly exaggerated actually, became known, Cardinal Manning writes, "In a moment, all the world rose up to meet them. Governments, politicians, newspapers, schismatical, heretical, infidel, Jewish, revolutionary, as with one unerring instinct, united in extolling and setting forth the virtue, learning, science, eloquence, nobleness, heroism of this international opposition, with an iteration truly Homeric. Certain epithets were perpetually linked to certain names. All who were against Rome were written up. All who were for Rome were written down." And he goes on to explain that, "By a wonderful disposition of things, for the good, no doubt, of the human race, and above all of the Church itself, the Council was divided into a majority and a minority, and by an even more beneficent and admirable provision, it was so ordered that the theology, philosophy, science, culture, intellectual power, logical acumen, eloquence, candour, nobleness of mind, independence of spirit, courage and elevation of character in the Council were all to be found in the minority. The majority was naturally a dead sea of superstition, narrowness, shallowness, ignorance, prejudice, without theology, philosophy, science or eloquence, gathered from the old Catholic countries, bigoted, tyrannical, deaf to reason, with a herd of curial and Italian prelates and mere vicars apostolic. The cardinal presidents remain of imperious and overbearing character, who, by violent ringing of bells and intemperate interruptions, cut short the calm and inexorable logic of the minority. But the conduct of the majority was still more overbearing. By violent outcries, menacing gestures, and clamorous manifestations round the tribune, they drowned the thrilling eloquence of the minority and compelled unanswerable orators to descend. Cardinal Manning went to great lengths to demythologize the false picture of the council built up by the press. All its allegations, whether generalized or particular, were examined by him and totally refuted. But as I'm going to show was the case with the Vatican II, it was the myth that the press built up that has still remained today the reality in the popular imagination. Cardinal Manning tells us someone from England wrote to him and said, what must we really believe concerning the council? And he replied, read carefully the correspondence from Rome published in England, believe the reverse, and you will not be far from the truth. Which links up with what John was saying. He noted the manner in which the press campaign designed to undermine the council had clearly been prearranged and was carefully coordinated. He writes, a league of newspapers fed from a common centre diffuse hope and confidence in all countries that the science and enlightenment of the minority would save the Catholic Church from the immoderate pretensions of Rome and the superstitious ignorance of the universal episcopate. The circularization of bishops, which took place during Vatican II, also had its counterpart in Vatican I. An anonymous document was received by the bishops, which appeared simultaneously in French, English, German, Italian and Spanish, elaborately arguing against the opportunists of defining the infallibility of the Roman pontiffs. And Cardinal Manning also remarks on how difficult such a press campaign made it for the council to give its entire attention to the discussion of the important matters in its agenda, a problem which was magnified many times over for the bishops of Vatican II. He writes, it is obvious that for the treatment of such matters as were before the Vatican Council, a complete independence and tranquility of mind were necessary, a thing impossible under the relentless assault of hostile governments and an ubiquitous press, with the perpetual harassing of half-informed friends and incessant misrepresentations of enemies. And the secrecy of the council was also violated, just as would be the case during Vatican II. Cardinal Manning writes, the enemies of the Church were in intimate and constant communication with those who were in opposition to the council. Many of them obtained every schema as it was distributed to the bishops. It is to be remembered that this fact proves the violation of the secret imposed on all who were within the council, and in those who had sworn to its observance, it involved perjury. The campaign against the First Vatican Council failed, of course, and it failed because Pope Pius IX would not weaken. He met error with condemnation and replied to any demands to modify or adapt Catholic truth to the spirit of the age by restating it with the firmness and clarity of Trent. And despite the prophecies of her enemies, the declaration of papal infallibility would mark the death blow for the Church, she emerged stronger and more vigorous than ever. In my first lecture, I quoted Cardinal Heenan to the effect that most bishops arrived at the council without any clearly formulated views and policies, and were thus ideally placed to be influenced by those who were quite definite about what they wished to achieve. If you had told me 2 years ago that I would be voting for some of the things I've been voting for this session, I would have told you were crazy, commented Bishop Joseph J. Mueller of Sioux City in Iowa. Father Wilkin expressed regret that all the Episcopal Conference didn't work with the same intensity as the Rhine bishops and their supporters. Had they done so, he says, the rest of the council wouldn't have found it necessary to accept the positions of the World Alliance with so little questioning. It would have then been less one-sided, and its achievements would truly have been the result of a worldwide theological effort. But I think Father Wilkin is rather unrealistic here. The strategy of the Rhine group was that of a definite party with a definite policy, and it had a nucleus of a party and a definite policy before the council opened. Without such a nucleus and without such a policy, there was no hope of a viable alternative to the Rhine group being formed. At a later stage, the International Group of Fathers, of which Monsignor Lefebvre was a leading member, began to offer sufficient opposition to make the Rhine group anxious. But this didn't happen to the third session, when the control of the Rhine group was so absolute that it could not possibly be broken. The fact is that most of the bishops had come to the council not as members of a party, but simply as Catholic bishops. Why they had come to Rome and what they were supposed to do there was something they hoped to discover as the council progressed. The greatest concern of many fathers soon became that of coming to terms with modern man, with the spirit of the age, and entering into a dialogue with the world. These, of course, are very nebulous concepts to which it would be hard to attach any concrete meaning. To a very large extent, they are the creations of the press, and insofar as they do have any meaning, it is the meaning that the mass media impart to them. The mass media, the press in particular, played a key role in conjuring up the mood of the council, the so-called spirit of Vatican II, the mood of euphoria in which so many of the bishops were happy to be told what the world expected from them and happy not to disappoint the world. Many a bishop, Bishop Tracy wrote to his people in Baton Rouge, many a bishop revised the attitudes of a lifetime on certain reforms once he saw the mood and spirit of the council, hence the big votes, which were all but unanimous on most points. The French oratorian, Father Louis Bouillet, remarked, "I do not know whether, as we are told, the council has freed us from the tyranny of the Roman Curia, but what is sure that willy-nilly it has handed us over after having first surrendered itself to the dictatorship of the journalists, and particularly the most incompetent and irresponsible among them." When Father Bouillet states that the council surrendered itself to the dictatorship of the journalists, he means in effect to the Rhine group, for almost every influential journal and journalist supported the Rhine group program. Among the best names are John Cogley of Commonweal, Robert Kaiser of Time, Xavier Rinn of the New Yorker, Michael Novak, who represented a number of American papers, Father Antoine Wegner of La Croix, and probably the most influential of all, Henri Fesquet of Le Monde. These journalists all expanded their reports on the council into books, which appeared while the council was still taking place or shortly afterwards, and thus consolidated for these journalists the myth that they themselves had created. And it's this myth that has become for most Catholics the only real council. I've already mentioned Father Wilkin in my last talk, and he wasn't in any way conservative or traditionalist. If anything, he was quite liberal. But he was, unlike most of the journalists there, he was totally objective, and he reported what actually took place during the council. His book, which you can get from Tan Books, so I'm glad to say, is being described as documenting the unknown council, and because for most people what actually took place at Vatican II is still unknown. Robert Kaiser, who I just mentioned, wrote for Time magazine, concedes that the reporters were almost all on the progressive side, probably because they realized that although Christianity was the same, its message had to be adapted to the progress of history, while the motto "Con Ottaviani semper idem," always the same, carried to its logical conclusion, would put the Catholic press out of business tomorrow. The basic premise of the modernism that I described to you last year is that the Christian message must be adapted to the progress of history, which is what Robert Kaiser just said. And the modernist concept accepts the possibility of radical change in the message itself, not just in the way that it's presented, which was what Pope John hoped for in his opening statement. As I'm sure all of you know, the Catholic establishment in the United States is now very much a progressive establishment. Writing in The Critic, a leading establishment journal, a journalist called John Leo stated quite openly, "It is the establishment that decides what Catholics will discuss, not just in establishment journals, but after a time lag in nearly all Catholic journals and discussion groups from coast to coast. The birth control discussion in the United States, for instance, was entirely an establishment production." Robert Hoyt, who is editor of the ultra-liberal National Catholic Reporter, stated with no little satisfaction, "There is a liberal conspiracy, in the sense John Courtney Murray used the word of a breathing together, conspiratio. Liberal theologians dominate the public prints, the catechetical training centres, the publishing houses, the professional associations, much of the Catholic bureaucracy. They praise each other's books, award each other contracts, jobs, awards and perquisites. There wasn't anything sinister in all this. It wasn't planned. It just happened. There has never been a council in which slogans played so important a role as during Vatican II. The progressive establishment has now codified these slogans into a complete system of belief, which its members clearly find more satisfying than scripture and tradition as the basis of their faith. The prime tenets of this new creed are to read the signs of the times, to be open, to dialogue, to cater for the needs of contemporary man, and above all, to do everything in the spirit of Vatican II. It hardly needs saying that these slogans do not mean what they might appear to mean on a first reading. In fact, as with the Newspeak devised by George Orwell in his novel 1984, some of these slogans mean precisely the opposite to what they might seem to convey. For example, to be open and to dialogue means in practice that wherever possible, anyone who deviates from the party line will be prevented from expressing his views in public, or at least in a manner which will enable a large section of the public to learn his views. One of the key slogans, which was accepted as an article of faith from the very beginning of the Council, was for the news of those in authority to respond to public opinion. A French bishop remarked after the first session, "Formerly, only theologians were interested in considered text. Today, bishops are faced with a public opinion which looks avidly to the text coming out of the Council." He adds that this state of affairs was brought about by the public press. The manner in which the public opinion, which the press claims to reflect, is often imposed on the public by the press is a fact of secular life, which I'll try not to digress on that. But as you know, how the grip the press has on, or all the media has on national life now in all Western countries is uniform everywhere. You take the way they develop the acceptance of homosexuality. You find hardly any major paper now that would dare to, make an attack on this terrible perversion for what it is. And in a lot of jobs, you lose your job if you express your opinion. And they establish a consensus, and you can have discussions, but only within that consensus. And Father Louis Boyer, referring specifically to the Church, says the consensus fidelium is something quite different from a public opinion which is manipulated and even fabricated by a press, which, even when it is not completely led off the track by its pursuit of the sensational, remains hardly or not at all capable of grasping the real import of the questions under consideration or simply their true meaning. So let me stress once again that this public opinion, it does not originate with the public. The public just regurgitates what the prefabricators have convinced it into believing that is what it thinks. Professor Hitchcock provides considerable documentation in his excellent book, another book you should get, The Decline and Fall of Radical Catholicism, to show the contempt which liberals have for ordinary believers. They describe them in a series of documented quotations which Hitchcock provides as a herd which is straying apathetically behind and is difficult to love. The ordinary believer is a superstitious religious caterpillar. Father Gerard Sloyan, a prominent member of the catechetical establishment, said after the Second Vatican Council about the Catholic laity what the Duke of Wellington said about the British Army. He said, "They may not scare the enemy, but by God, they scare me." Father Antoine Regner of La Croix, who used to tell the French bishops what to think and what to say, makes the following comments with regard to Archbishop Carley, who is a member of the International Group of Fathers. You mustn't mix up this International Group of Fathers to which Archbishop of Fevre, Bishop Seni, Bishop Seago from Brazil all belong. That's the International Group of Fathers, and the Rhine Group are either the European Alliance or the World Alliance. And this is what this Father Wagner wrote in La Croix, which is the official paper of the French bishops. He has often been heard during the first session. His pathetic voice will again often be heard, and his specious arguments in favour of the primacy and against the collegiality of the bishops. So the crime of Bishop Carley was, of course, to hold different views from those of Father Wegner. Similarly, Henri Fesquet never had the slightest doubt that his grasp of theology was far more profound than any bishop who had the temerity to depart from the prefabricated consensus which most of the fathers had been conditioned to accept. Throughout his very verbose and very expensive book, Le Journal du Concile, which is over 1,100 pages long, you can see this spirit of Vatican II everywhere. And there's the more than implicit presumption that to deviate by even a hair's breadth from the rigid party line which he adopts denotes intellectual bankruptcy and theological ignorance. As regards the international group of fathers, Henri Fesquet writes, and you see how similar this is to what Cardinal Manning said about the First Vatican Council. For these bishops and for those who think like them, it appears quite obvious that Catholicism is the only true religion, and that the idea of being a Protestant or a Marxist is quite unthinkable. Such attitudes have horrified many who have heard them expressed, but they are indicative of an attitude still widely held in certain countries with a largely Catholic population. They reveal a scarcely credible narrowness of outlook and a total disregard for the most elementary sense of respect for one's neighbour. This sectarianism is totally incompatible with justice and, a fortiori, the charity demanded by the Gospels. Professor Hitchcock shows that the Liberals' formula for change has been entirely elitist, the imposing of reform from above by an enlightened few. He speaks of the Liberal assumption that their own needs, their own sensibilities, their own insights have a priority and superiority which the Church must recognise. When progressives, writes Professor Hitchcock, when progressives speak of the Church's insensitivity to human needs, they mean exclusively insensitivity to their own needs. Once again, this theory of the duty of the Church to adapt to contemporary needs was put forward by the early modernists. St. Pius X draws particular attention to this whole theory of necessities or needs, for beyond all that we have seen, it is, as it were, the base and foundation of that famous method which they describe as historical. One of the most pressing of these alleged needs, where the liturgy is concerned, was that of accommodation to the manners and customs of peoples. Now, we do not expect the secular press to have any sympathy for traditional Catholicism in any of its aspects, but where the reporting of Vatican II was concerned, Father Bouyer reserves particular censure for those so-called Catholic journalists who claimed expert knowledge but seemed tiresomely inclined to adopt the worst irregularities of their new craft by seeking out the sensational and even the scandalous when they were not imposing their own disreputable points of view with every means, including slander and blackmail. After this, we need not complain if the professional journalists did not do much better. Father Bouyer continues, since that time, this phenomenon has only grown and become more complex. Most of the theologians who courted the great press contracted with sometimes caricatural excesses these glaring vices so cheerfully that it makes us wonder about the roots of their attachment to truth. When we see them today in close ranks, sending thundering condemnations of papal encyclicals to the press before even having had time to read them, in order to get ahead of, and if possible surpass, the daring of the secular or non-Catholic commentators themselves, we can begin to appreciate the gravity of the evil. The first task of the prefabricators was to concoct a myth, which would result in those being conditioned accepting certain basic assumptions. These would trigger off the required reflex when the correct stimulus was applied. Father Bouyer outlines this basic myth as follows. On one side, there were the bad guys, most of whom were Italians with a rare exception of an Irishman or a Spaniard. On the other side, the good guys were all non-Italians with two exceptions. One party included the Ottavianis, the Ruffinis, the Browns, the Heenans, and the other the Frings, the Legers, the Swenins, and the Alfrinks, merely to mention the Porporati. The first group was uniformly rascally, stupid, and niggardly, while the second was equally beyond reproach, bright, and noble. Such a created mythology fittingly bolstered the slogans. On the one side you had tradition, identified as the most desperate obscurantism, while the other party bespoke complete newness in a noonday light. Authority was pictured as against freedom and vice versa. Bishop G.P. Dwyer of Leeds in England, in a review of Robert Kaiser's book Inside the Council, expressed himself in terms very similar to those of Father Bouyer. Like the Mounties from across the border, he, Kaiser, always gets his man, and he got him, Cardinal Ottaviani in the Curia. As in a standard TV horse opera, the cast is divided into goodies and baddies. The former very, very good and always larger than life. The latter, the villains of the piece. In contrast with the liberals who are good, tolerant and brilliant, Robert Kaiser continues the Curialists not only to be bad, but brainless. The bishops, he writes, were learning too about the intellectual bankruptcy of the Curialists in Rome. When they held conferences with integralist theologians, they found them a defensive lot, inclined to rely not on reasoned argument, but on wild charges. It must be presumed that Kaiser had charismatic gifts in order to discover these facts. In contrast with the Curialists, theologians such as Hans Kung are theologians on the march, men well equipped with the ideas that dovetail neatly into the needs of pastors around the world. Pope Pius XII, says Kaiser, was no more than a small-town aristocrat who wrote rivers of words, but was simply not listened to with understanding by a church composed of intelligent beings. He is even able to reveal that not all the bishops to whom the encyclicals of Pope Pius were addressed bothered to read them. He makes special mention of the encyclical Humani Generis, which, he assures us, could not have survived the climate of Vatican II. And in this respect, he's certainly correct. But this is a condemnation of Vatican II and not of the encyclical. To this council, Kaiser writes, Humani Generis would have been too juridical, too scholastic, too authoritarian, too negative, too narrow, too pessimistic, destructive of theological progress, not ecumenical, not biblical, not patristic. How much Kaiser knew about patristics? It'd be interesting to find out. Wonder if he would have even been able to name half a dozen of the fathers. But anyway, the declaration of papal infallibility by Vatican I is described by Kaiser as a heedlessly divisive act and a demonstration of the futility of formalism in the face of the 19th century revolt against authority. To state that the progressive heroes were depicted as larger than life is a considerable understatement. Hamish Fraser noted that the progressive establishment has a particular talent for manufacturing synthetic reputations. Some journalists apparently became so caught up in the myth which they had created that they began to deify their heroes in writing reminiscent of the build-up given to the instant stars of the recording world in pop music journals. A comparatively mild example can be seen in the build-up given by Michael Novak to Cardinal Swenins, the Archbishop of Malines. This is what Novak says. Cardinal Swenins is a strong, direct, business-like man. His influence at the council seemed for a time second only to that of the Pope. So much so that there were those who in the early stages of the session at least were calling the council the First Council of Malines. On one occasion, when the Pope was visiting a church in Rome, Cardinal Swenins was seen taking the Pope by the arm, moving him here and there, introducing him. The Cardinal is the type of man who controls the situation in which he finds himself. His voice is emphatic and clear. His ideas are forcefully presented. He seems par excellence the type of the modern bishop, learned, active, capable, profound. An 18-line description of Cardinal Bayer by Robert Kaiser makes Novak's description of Swenins impossibly reticent. Kaiser manifests what can only be adoration for this liberal hero. The Cardinal has rounded blue eyes, observant, penetrating, flickering with sudden deep intelligence. A thin, slight, stoop-shouldered frame, bowed but not weighted beneath the burden of thought, and giving the impression of a mind encased in a tenement of clay, bespoke the fire ready to be kindled, the suppleness of restraint, the measured discretion to accept the real, the reserved power to attempt the possible, the air of intellectual dominion and practical conviction that the draught of life's potion given to him was to be tasted to its subtlest fineness, distilled and distinguished as a fine oblation to the Father of all things. But Michael Novak, he wouldn't allow himself to be outshone by his chum Bob Kaiser. So when Hans Kung spoke in America, Novak had the privilege of sitting at his feet. He recounts the experience as followed. The tension in the hall was electric. It's a very original little metaphor, isn't it? The tension in the hall was electric. In his clear, forceful voice, his blonde hair shining in the lights. Father Kung brought the strong, careful theology of Europe to American audiences caught up in the enthusiasm of Pope John's Aggiornamento. And Novak reports that Dr. Kung spoke to audiences of up to 8,000, and when he says that they were caught up in the enthusiasm of Pope John's Aggiornamento, this can be translated that they were reacting as journalists like Novak had told them to react in response to what journalists like Novak had told them the aggiornamento meant. This was only the initial stages of the Kung cult, which the prefabricators were working on. Few of his works had been translated into English at that time, but the readers of liberal journals were told that he was a great theologian and profound thinker, and they responded with the conditioned reflex of admiration. Kung was the man to hear and the man to quote, so they duly heard him and quoted him. Basically, there was not a great deal to choose between the promotion of Hans Kung to middle-class Catholic audiences at that time and that of the Beatles to the teenage market. They were both being promoted consecutively. Robert Kaiser certainly admired Cardinal Suenens as much as Novak did. He says, "The Belgian cardinal is an impressive figure, tall, lean, greying at the temples, his eyes flashing out of deep sockets. Though one of the youngest and newest cardinals, he already had a reputation as a towering intellectual," because, of course, Robert Kaiser said in Time magazine he had a reputation as an intellectual. I'm sure most people agree that most people in the United States, if they read something in Time magazine, they think, well, that's it. You know, if it's in Time, it must be correct. And Kaiser, Robert Kaiser, he seems, as I said, he seemed to have had kind of charismatic gifts. And he mentions a speech made by Suenens during the council, during one of the debates, and he says, "Many were stirred by his words, and those stirred included Pope John." And this is a little strange because the Pope was in his apartment at the time. But nonetheless, even his most secret thoughts were known to the intrepid correspondent of Time. Robert Kaiser wrote, "In his private apartment, John the 23rd sat watching on a closed-circuit television, and he too was stirred. 'At last the fathers are beginning to understand what this council is for,' he said." Any father who expresses sentiments acceptable to Mr. Kaiser is rewarded with almost superhuman qualities. Bishop de Smet from Belgium makes a speech in favour of ecumenism, and while doing so, rolls his eyes over the assembly with the pinpointing magnetism of a born orator. The bishop expounds the virtues of ecumenism with obviously inspired words. And you might recollect that Cardinal Manning said that, as regards the reporting on Vatican II, "All theology, philosophy, science, culture, intellectual power, logical acumen, eloquence, candour, nobleness of mind, independence of spirit, courage and elevation of character in the council were the exclusive prerogative of those fathers of whom the press approved. And if the Cardinal had made a similar study of Vatican II, he would have needed to change one word of this assessment." Monsignor Bandas of St. Paul, Minnesota, said on several occasions that the possible good effects of the council were being sabotaged by misinformation propagated by vast sections of both the secular and religious press. He expressed himself particularly bewildered and saddened by the reports appearing in Time, Newsweek, and The New Yorker. I want to quote Father Louis Bouillet again. "If you can get hold of this book, The Decomposition of Catholicism, you should do so, but it would have to be second-hand." This is what he says. "It must be said that whatever respect we may have for our bishops and for the conscientiousness with which they wish to perform their task in the council, many of them were ill prepared to exercise their role amid the blasts of such a clamorous publicity, which was so often motivated by concerns that had very little in common with what they should have been. Under these circumstances, we ought not to be too surprised, especially during the last session of the Council, if many of the Fathers' interventions and reactions were much more conditioned, doubtlessly without realizing it, by a desire to please their new masters in the press. A stage was reached eventually when some fathers felt that more could be gained by a statement to the press than a speech in the council hall. Archbishop T.T. Roberts, who was a Jesuit, a very progressive English father, told a gathering of reporters, "I know that if I give my talk to the press, many more will see it and understand it than if I give it in the aula." Cardinal Heenan complained that although secrecy was supposed to be maintained regarding speeches made in the council hall and an oath had been taken to this effect, even during the first session this was often no more than a fiction. The substance, or more often the complete text, was available to enterprising journalists, just as happened with Vatican I. This illustrates the close cooperation which existed between the Liberal Fathers, their parity, and the press. 12 hours before the Council Fathers knew whom they had elected to the Conciliar Commission, The complete list had appeared in a secular newspaper. Robert Kaiser tells us that Le Monde reporter Henri Fesquet turned in 3 or 4 stories a week full of insight and penetration. And he said it's obvious that many of the fathers and theologians were using Le Monde to get the word. In other words, rather than Le Monde reporting what the bishops had said, the bishops were using Le Monde to discover what they were supposed to say. Kaiser's praise for Fesquet's reports as being full of insight and penetration is a typical example of the way in which these liberal journalists always used to praise each other. And these men, they certainly constituted the most uninhibited mutual admiration society in journalistic history. Kaiser tells us that the New Yorker's required reading for the American bishops. That was, of course, Xavier Rinn wrote for the New Yorker. And Kaiser was assured by a member of Cardinal Bear's secretariat that the press had a profound influence on the fathers. It was, in fact, one of the factors that helped the fathers to find their collegiality, their sense of universal responsibility for moving the bark of Peter. There was a great deal of informal contact between the liberal journalists, fathers and Pariti. Robert Kaiser and his wife gave regular Sunday evening buffet suppers at which leading representatives of all 3 groups attended. These suppers were, another of the journalists wrote, these suppers were a small powerhouse of energy and conversation, one of the most successful institutions in Rome. Here, Father Malachi Martin S.J., the thin, wiry Irish scripture scholar, dashed from group to group with his rapid-fire questions and bits of information. Father Francis X. Murphy, CSSR, smoked his pipe in his sly, observant way. A wide spectrum of the world's bishops appeared on alternate Sundays. It is, by the way, highly probable this Father Francis Xavier Murphy was the pseudonymous Xavier Rinn. Needless to say, Robert Kaiser was praised by his fellow journalists just as much as he praised them. No one knew more about the council than Robert Kaiser, said Michael Novak. No one had talked with more of its personalities, prominent or minor, or had more sources of information to tap. In the English-speaking world, at least, perhaps no source was to have quite the catalytic effect as time on opinion outside the council, and this is interesting, and even within it. It is worth noticing, though, how the same conclusions are reached by those with different views. Novak and Father Bouyer are both agreed regarding the influence of the press, but differ as to whether the influence was good or bad. Robert Kaiser is also in accord with Father Bouyer concerning the extent of press influence, but there is no doubt that he considers it to have been all to the good. One wonders, Kaiser asks, why there should be no outside influence on a council father. Is the authority of the church meant to dominate or serve? If it is to dominate, then there is no need for the bearers of that authority to listen. But if it is to serve, then those bearers of authority have to be attentive to the expressed needs of the world. Kaiser assumes, of course, that the expressed needs of the world correspond with the esoteric preoccupation of his own elitist clique. He goes on to explain that some members of the church are very possibly full of the charismatic influence of the Holy Spirit, and that the only way in which the institutional church, that is the bishops, can learn what the Spirit, who breathes where it wills, wishes them to learn from is through the instrumentality of the modern press. Well, that's a point of view, I suppose. The theory that God teaches the bishops through the instrumentality of the liberal press is certainly novel. But the depressing fact is that it was a theory which was accepted wholeheartedly by so many of the bishops who vied with each other in the concern to please their new masters, as Louis Buet expressed it. According to Cardinal Sunins, 2,800 bishops represented the faithful people at the council, and it was the faithful people who dictated the 9,000 proposals. The current of public opinion was blowing at all levels, but in order to strengthen the awareness of the people of God and for the Christian to assume his adult responsibilities of the church today, he needs daily enlightenment on events which have to be seen in the light of faith. The Catholic journalist, then, is the theologian of today. Well, once again, one can say that's a point of view. But of course, in fact, our Lord actually began the church with a hierarchy, appointed a hierarchy, and then they built up the people of God by teaching and baptizing them. And he also stated that the faithful were to listen to the apostles, and that in listening to them, they were listening to him. Now, according to Cardinal Sunans, the bishops are reduced to the status of delegates of the faithful whose mind is to be made known through the oracle of the public press. One very well-known journalist, the priest, Father Alting von Gezo, he said, the essence of our Lord's incarnation was Christ came to communicate with people, and every attempt to impede communication is a sin. Vatican II has shown the Church that she was the people of God before becoming a hierarchy. So by this, we're supposed to understand that our Lord was the first Christian journalist. And as I've just pointed out, the Church actually began with a hierarchy and not with the people of God. And as for impeding communication being a sin, one's lost for words of that statement. As Hamish Fraser has said, the real power of the mass media today doesn't just consist in spreading false or slanted information. It's suppressing information that they don't want people to know, and they're never more effective when deciding that we won't hear something, that we won't know anything. But there are only too many council fathers willing to manifest uncritical acceptance of the role which the press claimed for itself, and to offer homage to their new mentors. Cardinal Koenig, the Archbishop of Vienna, explains, public opinion has influenced the council. Public opinion has now taken over the role played by kings and princes in former times. The role of official representatives and ambassadors is now exercised by journalists. When a Catholic journalist has something to say, he need not always wait for the permission of a bishop or information from Rome. He must alert those he considers need to be alerted. He must incite to action those who he considers need to be incited. He must inform the world about the Church and the Church about the world. He can and must open the mouth and the ears of the Church. He must not allow her to remain either deaf or mute. I mean, it's unbelievable, a cardinal. He was talking this out of rubbish. Monsignor Sturm, was the Archbishop of Sens and a member of the French Episcopal Committee of the Press for the Council, offered the following obsequious tribute. I must thank you for your fidelity and your elevated standard of professional integrity. Your task is not easy. I know your difficulties. I congratulate you on your magnificent effort. Satisfaction with the quality of your work is expressed on every side. This is all most encouraging for us. Once the Council Father was prepared to accept that public opinion, the voice of the people, was the voice of God, and that the journalists of the establishment press were the inspired and authentic interpreters of this infallible magisterium, then life was made very easy for him. I want to mention a bit now about the so-called Rome-Moscow agreement, which Hamish Fraser was the first person to expose this. And the Vatican considered that persuading Russian Orthodox observers to attend the council was a matter of the very highest priority. Monsignor Willibrand secured something of a diplomatic triumph when, after negotiations in Paris and Moscow, 2 Russian Orthodox observers arrived at the very last minute, contrary to everyone's expectations. According to the Soviet news agency Novosti, the Russian delegates expressed their satisfaction at the unaffected friendship of the Pope. At that time, as you all know, the administration of the Russian Orthodox Church was strictly under state control. So if observers came to the council, it was because the Soviet government considered that allowing this would advance its political ambitions, and for no other reason. In his celebrated 1972 Lenten letter to the Patriarch Pimen, head of the Orthodox Church, Solzhenitsyn asked, what could one say in favour of a church administration that is at the mercy of atheistic dictators appointed to control it by the Department for Religious Affairs? Peter Nichols, the Rome correspondent of the Times, claimed that during Monsignor Willibrand's Moscow visit, the 27th of September to the 2nd of October 1962, assurances were given that the council would not breathe a spirit of anti-communism. Henri Fesquet reported that the presence of the Russian observers was explained by the fact that the Kremlin had received the assurances that it had hoped for, les apaisements souhaités. If Monsignor Willibrand did enter into any definite agreement with the Kremlin, that there'd be nothing anti-communist would come out of the council, then it means that he had decided for the council what attitude it would adopt vis-à-vis communism. In other words, the council fathers had been deprived of their freedom of action. That this was indeed the case appears more than likely in view of the extraordinary steps that were taken to prevent the council condemning communism. Cardinal Alfrink, the Dutch cardinal, stated more than once that any new condemnation of Marxism or communism must be avoided, and when he spoke for the entire Rhine group. In an interview published by Novosti, the Soviet news agency, Archpriest Vitaly Boroyev and Archimandrite Vladimir Kotlярov praised the Council's favourable and auspicious beginning, as shown by the appeal of the Council Fathers for peace and by Pope John's pronouncement. One of the more sophisticated Soviet papers, the Literary Gazette, sent a special correspondent, M. Kledov, to Rome to cover the Council. He expressed approval at the general trend of the first session. So far, he wrote, the die-hard conservatives have failed to carry the day. They have not succeeded in their endeavour to turn the Council into a tool of their reactionary propaganda. Pope John the 23rd received his warm approval. One must pay tribute, he wrote, to the Pope, who has taken up a realistic position vis-à-vis some of the burning topics of the day. New tendencies have come to the fore in Vatican policy since the beginning of his pontificate. It is characteristic of the Pope's messages and encyclicals that they no longer contain any overt, furious condemnations of communism, any expression of unconditional support of NATO, any appeals to Western powers to pursue a hard policy towards the socialist countries. But Mr. Gredov was not completely satisfied. There are quite a few Catholic leaders who are still unwilling to give up their anti-Soviet and anti-communist dogmas. They are headed by Cardinal Ottaviani and his ilk. Cardinal Ottaviani had made his own views clear in 1960 in a speech which was seen at the time as an explicit criticism of the projected visit of the Italian president to Russia, and has since been interpreted as an implicit criticism of Pope John's new attitude to communism. This is what the Cardinal said. In the 20th century, it is still necessary to deplore genocide, mass deportations, slaughters like Katyn Wood, and massacres like Budapest. But some still stretch out their hands to the new Antichrist and even race to see who can first shake hands with him and exchange sweet smiles. Can a Christian confronted by one who massacres Christians and insults God smile and flatter? Can a Christian opt for an alliance with those who prepare for the coming of Antichrist in countries still free? Can we consider any relaxation of East-West tensions when the face of Christ is once more spat upon, crowned with thorns, and slapped? On the 15th of November 1960, Pope John received a birthday greeting from Khrushchev, who called him a man of peace. It's hardly necessary to point out that to be praised by a Soviet leader as a man of peace was equivalent to being called a man whose policies are helping the Soviet plan for world domination. Just as Pope John did not live to see the disastrous results of his council, he did not live to witness his more humane brand of communists invading Czechoslovakia in 1968 with as little compunction as Hungary had been invaded in 1956. When it suited the Soviets to dialogue, they dialogued. When it suited them to make war, they made war. But let me stress the fact, and this I think is very important, that not one of the liberal journalists who expressed all these high ideals about truth and openness, not one of them made the least complaint about the conditions attached to the presence of the Orthodox observers, which definitely curtail the freedom of speech of the Council Fathers, which these same journalists were pledged to uphold. This blatant display of double standards will appear even more scandalous when I tell you what happened next. There were a good many bishops present during Vatican II who had no illusions about communism and were determined to do all in their power to ensure that it was condemned. In my first lecture, I quoted Cardinal Manning's citation of Cardinal Pallavicino that to convoke a general council except when absolutely demanded by necessity is to tempt God. Communism was certainly the chief evil of our time, and was even more so at the time of the council. Archbishop Lefebvre is in no way exaggerating when he writes, the refusal by this pastoral council to issue any official condemnation of communism alone suffices to disgrace it for all time. when one thinks of the tens of millions of martyrs, of people having their personalities scientifically destroyed in psychiatric hospitals, serving as guinea pigs for all sorts of experiments. The absence of any specific condemnation of atheistic communism from the documents of the Council demonstrates more clearly than any single factor its almost total lack of relevance to the real world in the second half of the 20th century. It's almost as if the British cabinet had met to consider the problems facing Britain in 1940 and issued a communique in which the fact that we were at war with Hitler wasn't even mentioned. The manner in which the condemnation of atheistic communism was excluded from the Constitution on the Church and the Modern World is the most revealing example of the extent to which the progressives were prepared to go to achieve their ends. Atheism was going to be condemned in this document, but they wouldn't use the word Marxism or communism. There had been considerable pressure within the Council for an explicit condemnation of communism. The Rhine-controlled commissions which prepared the text would refer only to atheism. Cardinal Wyszynski, who had more to fear from speaking out against communism than any of his liberal counterparts in the West, demanded that there should be a schema on communism. He said, "If there is one error today which is serious and which endangers the world, it is indeed this one." Another bishop with ample experience of communism in action, Archbishop Paul Yupin of Nanking in China, asked in the name of 70 fathers for a chapter on atheistic communism to be added to the Constitution. He insisted that the Council must not neglect to discuss one of the greatest, most evident and most unfortunate of modern phenomena, particularly in order to meet the expectation of those who groan under the yoke of communism and are forced to endure indescribable sorrows unjustly. During the second session, 200 fathers from 46 countries had demanded a clear refutation of the errors of Marxism. The most effective force working against the progressives at this time was the International Group of Fathers, led by Archbishop Lefebvre, Archbishop Seago and Bishop de Castro Mayer. They drew up a petition giving 10 reasons why communism should be condemned and warned that if the Council remained silent on communism, it would be equivalent to disavowing all that had been said and done up to now. The Church had previously condemned communism on 200 occasions. The Fathers also warned that unless this omission was rectified, tomorrow the Council will be reproved, and justly so, for its silence on communism, which will be taken as a sign of cowardice and conniving. The International Group of Fathers received strong support, and 450 fathers signed written interventions asking for communism to be treated specifically in the schema on the Church and the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. On the 13th of November 1965, the commission responsible for the schema of this constitution distributed the revised version of the schema, which, contrary to the rules of the Council, contained no mention of the 450 interventions and no reference to communism. Bishop Carley sent an official protest to the Council presidency, quoting the rules of procedure, which stated that all amendments must be printed and communicated to the Council Fathers, so that they can decide by vote whether they wish to omit or reject each one. He quite correctly pointed out that if the commissions, and all the commissions were Rhine Group commissions, were to decide what the Council Fathers could and could not be allowed to vote on, then they, rather than the Fathers, constituted the Council. Cardinal Tisserand had the responsibility of conducting an official investigation. The first excuse given by the Commission was that the interventions had not been handed in within the prescribed time limit. I can confirm the fact that the amendments on communism did not reach either the members of the Commission or the Preti who are part of the Commission. There is no intrigue here of any sort. This placed the blame upon the International Group of Fathers for failing to deliver the interventions on time. However, such a move on the part of the Commission had been seen by Archbishops Seago and Lefebvre, who had delivered the interventions in person on the 9th of October 1965 at noon within the prescribed time limit. This put the blame squarely back upon the Commission. Eventually, Archbishop Guérin of Toulouse had to apologise and admit that the interventions on communism had indeed reached the offices of our Commission within the proper time, but were not examined, although they should have been, because unintentionally they had not been transmitted to the Commission members. And it was too late then for the text of the schema to be changed. But the Pope did intervene, and he added a footnote referring to two encyclicals condemning communism. So you could say that, at least implicitly, communism is condemned, but it's not condemned anywhere in the text. And how many people ever read footnotes? And one member of the commission, he mentioned, quite smugly, he said, "Oh, that's not the only intervention we sidetracked in this way." So, in other words, what Bishop Carley said was correct. It was the commission rather than the council fathers, in this case, who constituted the council. And the reason, which I've already mentioned, I've gone into such detail concerning this incident, is not for its intrinsic interest, though I think it is very interesting, but it's to demonstrate the complete hypocrisy of all the liberal journalists I've been citing. Cogley, Kaiser, Xavier Rinn, Novak, Gregory Baum, Henri Fesque and all. One can look in vain in their books, all of which I've purchased and read, and in not a single instance does the Commission receive even the most gentle rap on the knuckles for its duplicity. To put this matter in its proper perspective, imagine what a furore there would have been, what endless outbursts of shock, indignation and holy wrath there would have been from the secular and religious press had Cardinal Ottaviani deliberately prevented a properly filed amendment from being voted upon, lied about it, been proved to be lying, admitted doing the same thing on other occasions, and insisted that all the fathers had not been given a chance to express their opinion. What he had done had satisfied the council as a whole. The journalists that I've just cited, they devoted entire chapters of their books and called this the scandal of the century. These things, I've lived through them, writes Archbishop Lefebvre. If I tell you about it, it is not to condemn the council. It could have been a magnificent event, but as it turned out, one is bound to say, things took place which never should have been allowed. But you will reply, the council was inspired by the Holy Ghost. Not necessarily. A pastoral council, not dogmatic, is a form of teaching which does not of itself involve infallibility. And of course, there are no documents of the Second Vatican Council that have infallible status. There's a lot of infallible teaching in the Council, but it's where they repeat teaching that has already been defined as infallible. One of the most poignant moments of the Council occurred during the debate on the liturgy constitution. You probably have heard about it. Cardinal Ottaviani had very, very bad eyesight, and he had to speak without a text. And unlike most of the Council Fathers, he saw a lot of the implicit dangers in the liturgy constitution, and he started delivering a warning. He said, are we trying to stir up wonder or perhaps scandal among the Christian people by introducing changes in so venerable a rite that has been approved for so many centuries and is now so familiar? The rite of Holy Mass should not be treated as if it were a piece of cloth to be refashioned according to the whim of each generation. There was a 10-minute limit on speeches, which was by no means always enforced, but the Cardinal exceeded it and a bell was rung. Engrossed in his speech, he did not hear it and carried on. At a signal from Cardinal Alfrink, a technician switched off the microphone. After confirming the fact by tapping the instrument, Cardinal Ottaviani stumbled back to his seat in humiliation. The most powerful cardinal in the Curia had been silenced, and the Council Fathers clapped with glee. And why not? Cardinal Ottaviani was a bad guy, and Cardinal Alfrink was a good guy. Xavier Rinn comments, it seems to have caused Ottaviani to feel insulted and to remain away for almost 2 weeks. In other words, the bad guys are poor losers. One wonders, what the reaction of Xavier Rinn would have been if Cardinal Ottaviani had Cardinal Alfrink cut off in the middle of his speech. I even wonder if it's not possible when this poor half-blind old man was stumbled back to his seat, one of the fathers didn't say to him, prophesy unto us, who is it that cut thee off? And once again, this wasn't condemned by any of these journalists. They all found it very amusing. And I just have to read you this before I finish. I said that these journalists, it must have been the biggest mutual admiration society in the history of journalism, and liberals all take themselves terribly, terribly seriously. This is some of the most utter rubbish I've ever read, and if you don't believe it, I'll photocopy Michael Novak's book and show you that he really did write this. He reports on a long discussion which took place between some American journalists and 2 of the lay auditors charged with presenting lay opinion at the council, and this is what Novak writes. The group met in a large sitting room, and seated themselves on soft divans and chairs. A maid dressed in a pink dress with a tiny white apron wheeled in a cart with espresso, coffee, cigarettes and cigars. The two auditors were eager to learn about the attitudes of laymen in the United States. The Americans tried their best to explain the position of the American church, its coming out of the ghetto, the desire among the more highly educated Catholics to enter secular organizations and associations rather than Catholic ones. As the evening wore on, the maid brought in a tray of scotch, ice cubes and water. In a mood of relaxation, they couldn't help reflecting on the creativity of this age in the church's history. Here were 6 men trying to think what the future of the world in which they lived would be like. On one point, they all agreed. They wanted to leave as many doors open as possible. Not enough thought had gone into the position of the layman in the world to make it easy, and as yet to see just what a layman is or what he can do. John Cogley, with his unassuming smile and diffident way, began to talk more and more as the evening progressed. At one moment he remarked that he did not like the word, the layman's role. He liked to think of everything that laymen did as sacramental. Even, he said, looking around the room in which the men sat, even talking in this room, carrying on this conversation here tonight, I think that it's a holy thing, a good thing. The only comment I can make on that, I was wondering what the maid would have thought if she could have understood what they were talking about. We'll conclude by, it's rather sad, but it will interest you because it's about the United States. Pius X had condemned one of the things about modernism. He said that people who don't want to seem outdated, want to seem modern, want to seem intelligent, instead of condemning modernists, he said they often surrender and give themselves up to modernism. And one of the most depressing results of the council was the manner in which the European liberal party and their allies in the press were able to convert previously conservative theologians and bishops from countries such as the USA by convincing them that the one unforgivable sin was not to keep abreast with modern thinking, which of course was their thinking, not to read the signs of the times or to cling to outmoded beliefs and attitudes. Listen to Bishop William Adrian of Nashville, Tennessee. As the council developed, some of the originally somnolent American bishops, catching fire from their alert European colleagues, became the able engineers of liberal proposals, going beyond the Europeans in their ferocious vituperative attacks on the Roman Curia. Yet, however brilliant the American party may have been, they got their ideas from the European Catholic liberals, and some conservative Americans, following their second-rate party, joined the revolutionary group to bring about whatever their mentors thought best. The European party, who really imposed their theories upon the bishops, were themselves deeply imbued with the errors of Teilhardism and situation ethics, which errors ultimately destroy all faith and morality and all constituted authority. They make the person the centre and judge of all truth, and morality irrespective of what the Church teaches. It is the root of the evil of this disrespect for authority, divine and human. These liberal theologians seized on the council as a means of de-Catholicizing the Catholic Church while pretending only to de-Romanize it. By twisting words and using Protestant terminology and ideas, they succeeded in creating a mess whereby many Catholic priests, religious and laymen become so confused that they feel alienated from Catholic culture. There's a kind of little footnote to this talk. I'll just mention that John Cogley, who I've just told you he elevated smoking cigars and drinking whiskey to the level of a sacrament, he not only apostatized before his death in March 1976, but he was actually studying for the ministry of the Protestant Episcopalian Church, and he gave the reasons that prompted him to apostatize in a book, A Canterbury Pilgrim, which was published in the year he died. As a reporter for the journal Commonweal, no one had been more influential than Cogley in moulding the opinion of American Catholics as to what they should think of the Council and its reforms. I'll finish there.